Hello, everybody. It's now the 29th of March, Monday, 2021. Today's episode is going to be about statues for General Grant, statues for U.S. Grant. And before I get started, click on the notification bell click on the subscriber button below me to subscribe to future episodes, as well as the notification bell in the upper right. Okay, I'm going to pull up my notes here on U.S. Grant. Are U.S. Grant statues honorable? Modern biographers and historians have deified Ulysses Grant as a civil rights hero and exemplary president. In truth, his civil rights advocacy was aimed at the solitary racial minority that could keep his Republican Party in power, and the corruption during his presidency was monstrous. He did nothing for other ethnic minorities, such as Native Americans or Chinese Americans or even Irish immigrants. Moreover, he abandoned the freedmen after he concluded that his party could more likely remain in power by cutting them loose. Although today's cultural elites believe that postbellum Republicans promoted black suffrage as a moral impulse, the chief objective was to create Republican-controlled vassal regimes, puppet regimes in the South, to keep the infant GOP in power in Washington by way of carpetbag electors, senators, and congressmen. When the Civil War ended, the party was barely 10 years old. It might have been strangled in its cradle if re-admittance of the southern states had not been manipulated in a way to prevent Southerners from aligning with Northern Democrats to regain control of the federal government. Consequently, Republicans settled on two goals. First was mandatory black suffrage in the former Confederate states, if not the northern states, where inexperienced black voters could be directed to consistently support Republican interests. Second was to deny political power to the Southern white classes most likely to oppose Republicans. The latter was accomplished by disfranchising ex-Confederates through various federal and carpetbag state government actions. As a result, an 1868 Republican presidential candidate, Ulysses Grant, won the election with only a minority of America's white vote. Although he had a seemingly decisive 214 to 80 electoral vote margin, it hinged upon black votes and restrictions on ex-Confederates. In combination with the disfranchisement of former Confederates in Tennessee, Missouri, and West Virginia, ex-slaves gave Grant 67 of his 214 electoral votes. Without those 67 votes, the 1868 election would have resulted in a tie in the Electoral College. Thus, black voting rights were considered a necessity for power-hungry Republicans. Despite his modern reputation for civil rights activism, the experience of Grant's second Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, suggests the president had a hidden agenda. Specifically, America's railway industry may have led him to subvert the interests of Southern blacks to those of the railroad moguls. Ackerman was the second of President Grant's 5 attorneys generals. He served a little over a year from November 1870 to December 1871. He was the most vigorous of Grant's AGs in prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan. In order to expedite prosecutions, he expanded the powers of the newly created Federal Justice Department. About 600 Klan members were convicted. Grant, however, apparently revealed a secondary interest in racial justice when he abruptly asked Ackerman to resign in December 1871. Partly at the prompting of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, the president had misgivings about Ackerman's, quote, obsession, close quote, with the Klan. Perhaps more importantly, Ackerman also frustrated important Northern capitalists. He was, for example, critical of the dubious terms under which railroads sometimes qualified for federal subsidies. In June 1871, he denied land and bond grants to the Union Pacific Railroad, which was one of the chief beneficiaries of such grants. Shortly before resigning, Ackerman confronted Grant's previous Attorney General, Ebenezer Hoar, H-O-A-R, when the latter was representing a railroad client's land grant claims. Ackerman told Hoare that the client had not completed the work required to qualify for the grants. Nearly simultaneously, Interior Secretary Columbus Delano complained to Grant that Ackerman had annoyed railroad moguls Collis Huntington and Jay Gould with unfavorable rulings. Whether at the urgings of Fish, Delano, or Hoare, Grant replaced Ackerman with Oregonian George Williams, who later resigned under bribery accusations, as did Interior Secretary Delano. The New York World reported in January 1872 that Williams's appointment was essentially a triumph for the Pacific railroads, meaning the intercontinental railroads, transcontinental railroads. The year after he became president, Grant signed the 1870 Naturalization Act, which preferentially favored blacks compared to other so-called non-whites. Specifically, the act allowed blacks born outside the USA to become citizens through the same naturalization process available to whites, but it did not permit Chinese Americans or other so-called non-whites to utilize the process. For decades thereafter, Chinese American rights were far more restricted than those of whites and even those of blacks. They could not, for example, become naturalized citizens until 1943. Although often praised for funding the KKK enforcement acts to protect Southern black voters, few historians realize that Grant spent most of the money to police elections in the big cities of the North, where the immigrants, such as the Irish, often voted for Democrats. Ultimately, the freedmen's loyalty to the Republican Party was not enough to sustain Grant's interest in black civil rights. That became apparent during his second term during the autumn of 1875 in elections in Mississippi and Ohio. Grant twice turned down requests by Mississippi's Carpetbag governor to supply federal troops to police the polls on election day. But national sentiment was turning against federal interference in state affairs. Sentiment north and south was turning this way. 40 years later, black Republican Mississippi Congressman John Lynch revealed that Grant confessed to him that November in 1875 that Ohio politicians told the president that Mississippi intervention would likely cause Republicans to lose Ohio. Basically, Grant traded a Republican victory in Mississippi for a bigger one in Ohio. Thereafter, the Republican Party steadily lost interest in Southern blacks. They did not need black vote because the first 11 states that joined the Union after the start of the Civil War, beginning with Kansas in 1861 and ending with Utah in 1896, all 11 of those came with 2 new Republican senators each in a comparable situation in the House of Representatives. Despite a false reputation among hagiographers for sympathetic feelings toward Native Americans, President Grant ignited an illegal war with the Plains tribes in an attempt to lift the country out of an economic depression. Coincident with the 1873 flood of white immigrants into the northern Great Plains, a collapse in railroad speculation sent the American economy into a tailspin. As it progressively weakened, Grant pondered how earlier gold discoveries in California and the Rocky Mountains had promptly energized America's economy. Thus, in the summer of 1874, he sent a military expedition into the Black Hills of present-day South Dakota to investigate rumors of gold. Since the hills were part of the Lakota Sioux Reservation, officially off limits to white civilians, the expedition's goal was falsely reported as a site search for a new military fort. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer led the expedition into the hills, where they discovered modest but tempting quantities of gold. Soon, the first rush of prospectors began showing up. Initially, Grant made little effort to control the prospecting, but within a year, he decided the government must acquire the Black Hills. When the Indian leaders were summoned to Washington, they refused to relinquish the region. Grant ended the meeting by informing them that they must either cede the Black Hills or risk losing their rations. They departed without an agreement. Consequently, Grant contrived an excuse to start a war in order to justify seizing the hills by force. He planned to provoke a small minority of Lakota living off their reservation in, quote, unceded, close quote, lands, where the Fort Laramie Treaty granted them hunting privileges. They were off the reservation, but they did have hunting privileges here. So in November 1875, and hunting privileges meant, you got to take your camps with you when you're going hunting. In November 1875, Grant called the general commanding that region and the commissioner of Indian Affairs to the White House for a meeting. Together, they prepared an ultimatum requiring the Indians to return to their reservations by January 31st, 1876, or be declared hostile. In the dead of winter, it was impossible. It was an impossible demand. The result was the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn, which resulted in the deaths of Lieutenant Colonel Custer and about 300 cavalrymen. But the Indian victory was only temporary. Indian Commissioner George Manypenny arrived at the Sioux Reservation in September 1876 to essentially dictate a settlement. He compelled the tribes to accept his terms by telling them that they would be moved to present-day Oklahoma, forfeit their firearms and horses, and no longer be supplied rations if they declined to agree. Sioux descendants litigated the settlement well into the 20th century. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court awarded 8 tribes $106 million in compensation for, quote, a taking of tribal property, close quote. But the Sioux refused it. The money has remained in escrow and has grown to about $1 billion. Prior to the Supreme Court ruling, a lower court judge wrote in 1975 of the Manypenny Agreement and Grant's role in getting it accomplished. Quote, a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealing will never, in all probability, be found in our, meaning America's, history, close quote. It's interesting, last year when Trump went to Mount Rushmore, ABC News published an article about this because the evil Trump was carrying on with this, abuse of the Lakota. Well, this has been going on a long time before Trump was there, and it's still going on, and we have another president aside from Trump. Although I do not personally believe that Grant's statue should be torn down, in fairness, cancel culture warriors should consider his racism and other faults before continuing with the destruction of Confederate memorials. Now, for those of you that would like to learn more about this and Grant's role, much over glorified role in American history as a president, I recommend U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. You can get it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble for $20. I wrote it. If you want an autographed copy, it's $25 from me. I will pay postage if you live here in the United States. U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. Contact me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H at me.com. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.